ultimately less is more. So the smaller your profile you're able to get your product into, the more you're going to save. And you can shave half an inch or an inch off one of the sides of the packaging. You might have saved yourself a massive amount of fulfillment fees just from that small change.
In our recent State of the Amazon Seller Report, there's some interesting data in there to suggest that a lot of sellers are trying to source outside of China more than ever before. So I'm curious, do you have any tips for finding reliable suppliers elsewhere?
So China is still very well developed as a country, and everybody wants to leave China. There's a lot of reasons to leave China, right? For example, the political instability and relationships with them, especially from America and other things like that. But the challenge that a lot of sellers will find out is that a lot of times moving overseas, even to Mexico or Taiwan or to some other countries, a lot of times the suppliers are working with are Chinese suppliers that just opened up other locations in those countries. So Chinese suppliers are also moving out to a lot of those other countries. One thing to just keep in mind is that when you're moving to a manufacturing site outside of China, in China, everything is very consolidated. So your supplier might be ordering 20 different raw materials for each of your orders, and all 20 of those factories are domestic. So they're able to get supplies very quickly and at a very low cost and with minimal currency trade risks and things like that. But if you move that same manufacturing plant to, say, for example, India, that now might come from China. So you're still exposed to China for raw materials, or it might come from 10, 15 different countries if you're not sourcing from China. So you're still always somewhat dependent on China at some level in the chain. So it's important to go really deep into the chain if that your goal is to completely remove yourself from China. But keep in mind, your costs are probably going to go up. Manufacturers outside of China are not as experienced, especially in a lot of new product categories that are getting built out in these countries. So the risk of quality issues, the risk of issues with supplier communications and other manufacturing problems are a lot more likely. And you need to essentially mitigate or plan for those risks in your forecasts and your business plans.
Jake, I think you mentioned the State of the Amazon Seller Report that we had. Yeah, that's one of the trends we're definitely seeing. Like we saw sellers reporting where they're getting inventory from. It actually decreased year over year for the last 2 years from about like 74% to 71% we're getting inventory in China. And we're seeing that, like Sajug mentioned, India is probably the fastest growing. Now over 10% of sellers reporting they're actually sourcing inventory there. And then the next fastest is Vietnam. It's growing from, it almost doubled over the last 2 years. And it's up to about 5% of sellers saying that they're getting inventory from Vietnam. And so there's a number of countries going through that. In terms of how you can go find some of these, there's a lot of sources out there. We've actually are integrated now with almost a dozen different sources, all of the largest ones of suppliers. And we think we have really good coverage on most of the suppliers in the world. So if you go into Jungle Scout, we actually just finished a big overhaul of our supplier database. So if you go into the Jungle Scout tool, you can actually go through that and search for suppliers based off what industry they're in, what they're doing. And it can be a good way to kind of get leads on different suppliers you may want to talk to.
There's a lot of brands that do sell off of Amazon. And so for those brands that sell on and off the platform, what advice can you share for managing inventory effectively across multiple platforms?
Yeah, so one of the things that's actually really interesting is something that you see Temu and Shein doing. It's called Section 321, and it's essentially an exclusion. So if you were to ship a package into the United States under $800, you can exclude any customs or tariffs. For certain products, say, for example, your product has a 30% tariff on it, and you want to avoid that, you can actually send multiple individual shipments straight to your customers from overseas warehouses, or even Canada or Mexico qualify for that exclusion. So it's not just China, but we're actually seeing a lot of brands, especially on multi-channel, like for example, Shopify, or that have their own site, actually using Section 321 and using a warehouse in Mexico or Canada to ship their bulk inventory, store it at a lower storage cost, and then ship individual shipments into the United States as necessary when customers order. So that's something really interesting that could be worthwhile for certain brands.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. As you have more scale and capabilities and you're building buildings, you have more options. I think if you're maybe not quite at the scale where you're able to like have your own buildings, one of the options that if you are selling on Amazon you have is using AWD to fill into either Amazon for multi-channel fulfillment or into other 3PLs like Deliveroo or any of the other ones that are out there. For multi-channel fulfillment, that's probably the most commonly known. And essentially, it's like Amazon actually uses the same warehouses they use to fulfill like FBA orders or any of the other orders, but with a slightly different delivery promise. And so it lets you keep your single inventory pool, but it can be more expensive than other 3PL solutions. Generally, it's a little bit higher. It's a bit more reliable. They meet higher SLAs, and generally it's more scalable if you do get like those really large spikes. But you have a lot of drawbacks too, as in it's more expensive. You don't have control over your branding. The same limitations that you have on like FBA shipping also apply to your multi-channel. And I know a lot of like people go multi-channel to have a more differentiated experience where it's not in sort of just a generic box.
I want to dive deep into these two really big and common FBA fees, which are storage and fulfillment. For anyone watching this, do you guys have any of your favorite actionable strategies or advice that can help sellers minimize these two costs as much as possible?
Getting back to fee forecasting or fee prevention forecasting, one of my favorite things, so we talked about, monthly strategy and your weekly strategy and looking forward. One of the actually actionable ways, because it's nice to say that, but how do you actually get that done, right? If you don't have a platform, and there are actually not a lot of places to be able to look at that data in a good way. My favorite report on Amazon is the FBA inventory report. I don't think a lot of people actually know about it or know the power of this report. It has so much data. The data that you want to be able to avoid things like the low inventory level fee and the aged inventory fee in advance of them actually hitting are the historical days of supply, right? If you look into the fee, you'll see the historical days of supply, and it will tell you how many days of supply each of your ASIN has so that you can see, are any of those ASINs incurring fees? And then, so you're looking at anything below 28 days of supply. Being proactive, which I think is really important, versus reactive, which is generally, how we tend to be when it comes to fees. Being proactive, you want to also look at the 2 weeks in advance of that. So if you're looking at, starting at 42 days of supply, that you're starting to get into, a lower range. 35 days of supply is probably the minimum that I would go. So just searching that column inside of that report can be very helpful to knowing whether you need to slow down sales or, send more inventory in. And then you have inventory age. And I did want to say something. Actually, it's very, very timely today. Amazon, actually last night, they dropped some updates for the low inventory level fee that actually are going to be helpful to some sellers. I think they've taken on some feedback. And so things like if you are starting to sell out and retire a product, if that product has only sold 20 units in the last 7 days, they're not going to charge you those fees. So it may make sense to slow down your sales while you're retiring that product. Just things like this. And again, knowing the policy, I'm obsessed with knowing the policy. Also, they're creating a window, a 4-week window after your Prime Day sales. So if you have Prime Day deals, they're going to waive any low inventory fees that may apply after Prime Day. And then the last update that they announced was if Amazon's inbounding and processing fees have delays, they are going to refund any low inventory fees that are caused by Amazon's delays, which is great because a lot of people have been talking about that. Well, what if my inventory doesn't check in on time? So they're making these concessions. So those things are important to know. And then the last thing I'll say on this is that, again, the same report, the FBA inventory report, which you can find under fulfillment in the inventory section. It's actually all the way to the bottom. You have to click more to even be able to see it. The FBA inventory report also has inventory age. So you can see every single ASIN, how many units are at what age. If you know that you're incurring fees for one ASIN, it may be that only 300 out of the 1,000 units you have are incurring fees. So you don't want to pull out or liquidate all 1,000 units. You just want to handle the ones that are incurring those fees. So you can strategically go through and say, what inventory is in the column that's over a year? I need to focus on getting rid of that because I'm paying the highest amount of aged inventory fees, and then work your way back so that you're handling in a very strategic way anything that's causing you to pay monthly fees, so that you can not just be able to avoid those fees, but if you market them or if you liquidate them, you're actually putting a bit of cash back in your pocket. So you're taking a fee liability and turning it into a cash flow solution.
Yeah, and to double down on that, one other simple adjustment, maybe a little bit more complex for certain products, but one other adjustment you can make is actually resizing your product. And this is really doubling down on what Chelsea and I were saying earlier about the shipping cartons. If you can do that with your product, there's a lot of room for improvement. Ultimately, less is more. So the smaller your profile you're able to get your product into, the more you're going to save. Amazon charges based on size. So if you have a very small product and you can shave half an inch or an inch off one of the sides of the packaging to get it down by compressing the product inside, you might have saved yourself a massive amount in fulfillment fees just from that small change. So one thing to take a look at is just go through your products, see if there's any products that are very close to the breaks and the FBA size chart. And also just in general, if you think of any products that might be having a lot of extra space in the packaging that may not be necessary, and figure out how to compress that product down as little as possible.
That is great advice. The one thing I'll add to that maybe is just like how Amazon works at the warehouse. So when you go create your listing, you enter the dimensions. What's supposed to happen, and doesn't always, it happens most times, is the first time they see that product, they actually Cubiscan it. And it's a machine where they actually place your product in there and it measures it. Essentially, they have different versions. One uses lasers, one uses ultrasound, the newest ones use a camera. But essentially, it measures how big your product is. And that's what it writes in the catalog for fees. And so Amazon's catalog has like contribution scores. And essentially, the Cubiscan contribution score outweighs any seller's contribution score. So it will always take the Cubiscan as the most accurate. And that's what your fees are based off of. But they don't automatically go and re-Cubiscan over time. So if you do change your packaging, you then have to go submit a ticket through Seller Central and ask them to resize or re-Cubiscan your items to make sure they have accurate dimensions. And what that'll do is they'll basically trigger a ticket in the warehouse, and they'll go and pick any random unit out of some random warehouse that has the most capacity and go Cubiscan it. And so if you have inventory that's mixed of maybe some of the new dimensions and some of the old dimensions, you could potentially end up just getting the exact same one that was already measured. So you need to make sure you actually like sell through that inventory and then have them remeasure it to make sure you get those benefits. And now the flip side can be true is they can also add times when they do quality checks, randomly do this. And especially if you have like foldable inventory, they may have a t-shirt that was like all folded up and Cubiscan the first time, and now it's laid flat and is way bigger, and suddenly your fees spike. And so that's something you have to watch out about. Chelsea was talking about like the inventory report is a good way. If you have lots of SKUs, it can be difficult. There's also lots of tools that offer this. Like Jungle Scout has the alerts in it of when your fees suddenly jump, it'll also like post a warning. So it's something to be aware of, that these things can happen and surprise you.
Now, this was just a very small piece taken from the full webinar, but you can watch it all, plus get 10 more hours of exclusive content by visiting the link below. This year, Jungle Scout hosted our first ever Amazon Seller Week, where we teamed up with industry-leading experts to help sellers like you elevate and evolve your business. We covered 10 different learning sessions on topics like advanced advertising strategies, growth funding options, supply chain tips, and much more. And you can access all of it for free with the link below.